Welcome to the Center for Ethics and Human Values Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society program. My name is David Staley, professor in the Department of History here at Ohio State. This year's COMPAS theme has been Education in Our Democracy. Education, whether it occurs in K-12 settings, the university, or beyond, seems especially well suited to guide citizens in better appreciating facts and continue in their development of those skills necessary for life together. But what should be done when citizens disagree about what ought to be taught? What obligations might educational institutions have to the greater public they seek to serve? What dangers to democracy might be forestalled by good education or exacerbated under its flawed forms? How are these questions complicated within a social and political context marked by increasingly diverse views, values, and knowledge standards? While these questions are perhaps never very far from the minds of members of a university community, recent legal and political contests may have placed them at the forefront of far broader conversations. Understanding the serious ethical stakes of these interrelated concerns, this year's COMPAS program has invited collective consideration of education in our democracy. Today's panel discussion considers the question, what universities owe democracy? We are joined today by two distinguished panelists. Ronald J. Daniels has served as the 14th president of Johns Hopkins University since 2009. At Johns Hopkins, he has strengthened interdisciplinary collaboration in research and education, enhanced student access, deepened engagement with the city of Baltimore, and supported economic and social innovation. A law and economics scholar, he is the co-author of 8 books and dozens of scholarly articles on the intersections of law, economics, development, and public policy. His most recent book, What Universities Owe Democracy, takes up the challenges facing democracy and argues for the indispensable role that universities play in sustaining democratic societies at this critical moment in history. Between 2006 and 2011, Michael Ignatieff served as an MP in the Parliament of Canada, and then as leader of the Liberal Party and leader of the official opposition. He is a member of the Queen's Privy Council for Canada and holds 13 honorary degrees. Between 2012 and 2015, he served as Centennial Chair at the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs in New York. And between 2014 and 2016, he was the Edward R. Murrow Chair of the Press, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School.
I forgot mine.
His 20 books returned to a few recurrent themes: human rights and the fate of moral universalism in a world of clashing and competing values, liberalism as a political theory, as a practice, and as a way of life, and our struggle to maintain democratic freedoms. Professor Ignatieff was until recently the rector and president of Central European University in Budapest. He stepped down at the end of July 2021 to stay as a professor in the history department. President Daniels, Professor Ignatieff, thank you both for joining us today.
Nice to be here.
Great.
Well, so let's begin with this question. President Daniels, so what do universities owe democracy?
Well, thanks for the question, David. More than that, thanks for inviting me to be part of this really wonderful series. And so congratulations to you for leading this conversation and for the leadership you've brought to the academic community. Also, it's a thrill for me to be here with my friend and fellow Canadian, Michael Ignatieff, and as I've viewed acts of leadership in higher education since I've been president at Johns Hopkins, the act of leadership that Michael brought to Central European University is truly extraordinary and courageous and very consequential. So it's great to be here with you both. So you asked me, what do universities owe democracy? And the short answer to your question, quite simply, is a lot. The first president of the University of Chicago, William Rainey Harper, delivered a speech in 1899 about the relationship of universities and democracy, in which he claimed that the university had its birth in the democratic idea. Now, he was referring to the fact that the original universities in Europe were born out of spontaneous confederations of students that banded together to form an academic community. In Harper's view, universities and democracies have been profoundly and inextricably linked from the beginning. And I would argue that universities have been drawn ever closer to the democratic project in the last century. Liberal democracy is best soil for universities to thrive and flourish. At the same time, our universities are indispensable institutions in their contributions to good democratic governance. This is in no small part because universities and liberal democracies share so many core values. Each places a premium on freedom of speech and thought, on tolerance for dissent, on the free flow of information and ideas, and on the importance of shared and distributed authority. Universities, I believe, have an obligation to the democratic project in the same way that other indispensable institutions do, like independent media, competitive political parties, and independent courts. And our institutions realize this obligation in a number of different ways. In my book, which you referred to a moment ago, David, and I love every time you wave it. I know there's another free download that happens every time you do that. So thank you for that. I identify four functions that I feel are distinctive to the university and in which universities here in the United States and abroad can do more to fulfill. And these functions, which I focus on, are social mobility, civic education, the cultivation of expertise and the distribution and confirmation of facts, and finally, the fostering of pluralism. In all of these ways, I think that the university very meaningfully contributes to the quality, the success of the democratic project. And so hence, I really do believe we are indispensable for the flourishing of liberal democracy.
I think after years of Zooming, I remembered to unmute. Professor Ignatieff, I don't know if you wanted to respond to that initial question, what universities owe democracy?
It's great to be here with Ron, and he's written a wonderful book. So go out there, folks, and buy it. What I would add to it is simply Central European University, the university I ran, was founded in 1991 by George Soros, precisely because he saw a connection between universities and democracy. That is, as Eastern Europe came out of communism, he thought, I think wisely, that you couldn't have a free society without free universities. So that's, my university's been connected to an idea of spreading democracy in Eastern Europe that has been going on since 1991. I would go further and just elaborate Ron's point by saying, if you think about what liberal democracy is, it's power checking power to keep the people free, right? It's kind of what Madison would be saying to us. I think one of the ways to think about the university is that it's one of the counter-majoritarian institutions of a free society. Not in the sense that university should always be opposing the majority, but it's there to do one critical thing, which is to both train citizens, and Ron's talked about that, but also validate the knowledge we decide is true. It's not the only place that validates knowledge. It shouldn't have a monopoly in that, but it plays a crucial role in saying our best judgment is this fact about our society is true. And so when you have a debate about key issues, here are the facts you need. And universities are doing this every day across the United States, across the free world. They're just putting facts out there that people use in their political argument. And this seems to me is a crucial role. And in the social media age where everybody takes their opinions as truth, it's good to have a place that says, well, let's take a look at the facts. And when universities are doing their job, they play a very important role in adding that to the democratic debate. Now, let's not get holier than thou. There's a tremendous, this makes universities very unpopular. People then say, well, who are you to question what I believe and think and feel? So we have an antagonistic relationship to a lot of majority opinion, but that's our job. And so, without us, I think our societies are, on crucial issues of public policy, flying behind.
Professor Ignatieff, before we go too deep into this conversation, and for the benefit of those on the webinar that maybe aren't as familiar with the situation in Budapest, I wonder if you could just give us a sense of your experiences as president of CEU, and especially your relations with the Hungarian government. I'm trying to find a diplomatic way to say this.
I'll try and keep this short, but the university was founded, as I said earlier, in 1991 to assist societies in Eastern Europe to make a democratic transition. We are not a political institutions. Universities are not political institutions like political parties or even NGOs. They're institutions that, curate knowledge and spread knowledge and teach kids. And we were doing that in Budapest. And then when Viktor Orban won an electoral majority in 2010, he began to gerrymander the constitution, eliminate the independence of the Supreme Court, put his own people in control of the media, and create what he calls an illiberal democracy. That is, you have elections, but you don't have the countervailing institutions, as I said earlier, power checking, power to keep people free. He was trying to eliminate the checks on his power and on majority rule. At some point in 2017, facing a tough re-election, he decided to go after us as a symbol of an independent institution that was not in his control. And he passed a bill in about, it looked like law, it talked like law, it walked like law, but it was basically a piece of arbitrary executive, he rammed it through his parliament, and it rendered us effectively illegal. I can go into detail. We then fought it for 2 years, trying to find a compromise because we loved Budapest and wanted to stay. I repeat, we were not a political actor. We were a university. But long story short, despite the fact that the European Court of Justice found in our favor and thought that Orban's laws were a violation of basic European legal principles, he forced us out, and we're now in Vienna, where I'm happy to tell you we're doing fine. But we are the only university to be expelled from a EU member state, from a NATO ally of the United States since I don't know when. So it was a truly grievous attack on academic freedom. And while we've survived and are in good health, it tells you that free universities are the sworn enemies of illiberal autocrats.
Professor Ignatieff, what's the status of other universities in Hungary, or was it really just CEU that was so targeted?
No, I think it's important to say that we were the first step in a consolidation of state authority over institutions that had been free before. The pinnacle of the Hungarian academic system was the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, and he basically eviscerated its independence and then proceeded to take the state system, which was already under state control, and do something very interesting. He privatized the universities, gave them shares in state companies, then put his own party loyalists on the boards of all these universities, and basically effectively eliminated their academic freedom altogether. So we were the first test run of a comprehensive attempt to eliminate academic freedom in Hungary. And in case people think that it doesn't matter, it's worth remembering just what an incredible academic and intellectual tradition Hungary has. In the Manhattan Project, every time there was a problem with, how do we get this atom bomb to work, the conversation went into Hungarian. Why? Because most of the scientists were Hungarian. So, Hungary is a small country. America doesn't think much about it. But what happened in Hungary was an attack on a truly great academic tradition. And it should be a matter of concern to everybody who loves universities and loves academic freedom.
I don't have the page number here, President Daniels, but you write in your book, attacking universities is a time-worn page in the authoritarian's playbook. Is this just a problem in Hungary, or are we seeing this elsewhere? Please comment on this more, please.
Well, just to start, David, I go back to what Michael said a moment ago. Just by virtue of the values that we hold dear and the role that we play, it's not surprising that would-be autocrats are deeply threatened by, suspicious of, hostile to the university, because we, by definition, speak truth to power. That's what we do, and do that. When we do it best, we do it fearlessly. Just let the facts and a strong sense of principle take us wherever we need to go. So it's not surprising that autocrat bent on limiting the degrees of constraint of checks on power that he or she will face, not surprisingly, would go hard after universities. So the attack on the university in Hungary, and particularly as a member of the European community, is deeply troubling, and the extent to which the decisions of the European High Court and so forth have been ignored, and that Hungary still enjoys prerogatives as a member of the community, is something that, again, we all ought to be very concerned about. But having said that, Hungary is not alone. We see again this pattern of autocrats being fearful of, hostile to universities, replicated in case after case after case. Bolsonaro targeted universities early in his tenure as president of Brazil. Putin has steadily chipped away at the autonomy of universities and the academic freedom of faculty in Russia. The Taliban has dismantled universities in Afghanistan. Erdogan has jailed hundreds of scholars for criticizing the government. And these are just a few of the examples that we could highlight. And again, you see the extent to which there is now an international consortium of countries that still see themselves as having the veneer of democracy, but yet have moved in a decidedly liberal fashion and are targeting universities as a key instrument in the strategy to be able to consolidate power. So I think this is something that we need to worry about internationally. And here I would also acknowledge that the United States is not immune. Here we're seeing attacks on universities from state governments that are seeking to dictate what faculty can or cannot teach or research. We've seen the cultural wars play out in really perverse and troubling ways in terms of efforts to restrict discussions, exploration of critical race theory or gender equality and so forth. And, this is something that started with fierce rhetorical acts by politicians, but now it's begun to deepen, harden, and become manifest as legislative and regulatory crackdowns against academic freedom in many states. And again, these attacks run counter the foundational principles of universities and democracies as places devoting to protecting the fearless pursuit and expression of ideas. So here, I think it's important that we not be too complacent and understand the true fragility of liberal democracy and the extent to which those attacks on liberal democracy very often start with seemingly innocuous attacks on some aspects of the university, and then quickly morph to something much darker, more sinister, and more palpable.
Professor Ignatieff, you said a moment ago that universities are not political institutions. Did you mean CEU, or do you mean all universities are not political institutions?
I think they have an important role in keeping the waters of public intellectual debate kind of clean enough in the sense of fact-based, reality-based. Although, you know, non-university people who may be listening to this may be sick of our sanctimonious self-regard here. You know, I mean, universities speak as much rubbish as anybody else. I don't want to give us alibis and say we're perfect, but when universities do their job, we have disciplines. You know, I'm a historian. Some things are true in history, some things are just false, you know, and some, you know, Ron is a lawyer, an academic lawyer, you know, there's some things you can do with the law and some things you can't, you know, and our job is constantly to get back to our disciplines and talk about what we really know and do so securely. And that's our function. And that's not essentially a political function. It's a democratic function in the sense it's our contribution to sanity or fact and reason in political debate. We have no monopoly on wisdom, no monopoly on knowledge, but we've been here university's been here for more than 1,000 years as self-governing communities of scholars. And we're entitled to have a certain autonomy simply because as professionals, we know what the knowledge in our disciplines is, and therefore we're entitled, in my view, to recruit those people who meet certain academic standards to teach students. That's why our autonomy is important, because it safeguards and protects the knowledge on which a democracy depends. Politicians don't like it, as Ron says. They're state capital after state capital across the United States. There are people saying, you know, I, the governor of this state or that state, going to tell you what the state university system is going to teach. And that is deeply destructive of a dynamic, intellectually adventurous university system. It'll kill the university system. Nobody wants to be told what to teach. They'll walk. So it's damaging to the university and will cause harm to those state institutions. And so in the end, university independence and autonomy, while it's irritating to politicians because they pay the bills for state institutions and they think, well, we pay the bills, why don't we, tell them what to teach? But the smart thing in a democracy is to let institutions have independence so that they can do their jobs properly. It's not just university independence that matters. Doctors should have independence. Lawyers should have independence. In a free society, these should be self-governing institutions, and their freedom is critical to the freedom of others. And I often think universities haven't done as good a job as we could do to explain this idea. It sounds as if we're just defending a set of privileges. Academic freedom is not a privilege. It's a set of responsibilities that we have to curate knowledge, to teach what is true, and to serve our societies. And, we don't always do it right, but that's what we need to do. And the public, I hope, needs to understand that when politicians take after a university, they end up doing the university damage, but they also may do democracy some damage too.
President Daniels, your thoughts on universities as political institutions?
So, this is a debate as to, whether we take stands that are seen to be too nakedly political and, therefore attract this kind of criticism around the positions that we take. I think, first and foremost, the university, at least in my experience, doesn't speak on many issues qua university. What we are is a place where lots of faculty members and students have the capacity to speak on a range of different issues, and often they speak in conflict of one another. They don't agree, and we speak publicly. And to the extent that their debates, their criticisms have political content, I think that is to be expected. But that doesn't mean that the university itself is a political institution. In fact, in order to properly support the role of the university as a place where truly a place apart in our society, where there's open and vigorous contestation of received wisdom, it's really important that the university qua university, I think, take as few political positions as possible, and recognizing that you want to, in some sense, let your faculty and students, your key constituents, have the capacity to explore ideas without a sense that there is a party line. Now, there are times when you are sometimes required as university president to speak on an issue. And, for me, I do so very much with a sense of restraint and humility, in large measure going back to this sense of I'm trying to constantly preserve what I think is the essence of the institution, which is the ability for people to interrogate complex ideas, to take contrarian positions with one another, and don't want to, in some sense, put any kind of a constraint, a shadow, an expectation on their activities. But sometimes you find that there's a compelling interest on the part of the university. Years ago, when the Trump administration adopted the Muslim ban, that had a direct and clear impact on our ability to bring students back to our campus, to bring doctors and patients to our health system. And I felt that that was something that I was compelled to take a position on. And if that was understood to be political, so be it. But again, it was very much, to my mind, motivated by a clear and demonstrable interest of the university. And I try and as much as possible to limit the number of times that I speak up on those issues. I will say, and I think it's very timely in terms of the massive street protest that is underway across Israel today, when there's an effort by the Netanyahu coalition in Israel, which is an extremely radical right-wing coalition, which I think clearly illiberal and authoritarian dimensions to it, and an effort to essentially eviscerate the role of an independent judiciary in Israel. It's a moment where universities there have decided that that is something that there is a direct and clear interest to the ability of universities to do their work, that they have essentially decided to close their institutions and to issue statements of condemnation. Again, it's these moments when you really feel that there's such a compelling interest that requires institutions to act, but they're doing so in furtherance of this idea of protecting the ability of the university to be autonomous of society, to serve society, but to recognize its autonomy and its capacity for independent action, for critique, for education without agenda imposed from outside is absolutely essential for its role. So I think, there we have as we watch these protests, we see again the extent to which these are very live issues for universities, and can only be inspired by the role that these institutions are playing, and in a very challenging way, speaking truth to power.
No,
Sorry.
please.
I agree with everything that Ron has said, and one of the things he said is, if university presidents, do take public positions, they have to choose those public positions that are, viscerally important or existentially important to the university itself. You can't get into the rent-a-quote business, and I think Ron chose some very good examples of where there's such an overwhelming interest central to the university that the leadership of the university should take a position. there's a correlative obligation on the other side, which is very difficult for presidents, and I've been there, which is just to make sure that the university is as free a community in terms of intellectual discussion as it says it is. And that's very difficult. Universities get swept by tides of, moral certitude and political certitude. And universities have done themselves some harm, I think, by failing to stand up and keep the debate open and clear. And so this is where we have to be responsible to the society, just to make sure that our classrooms are as free of ideology as we can make it, that the debates are open, that all sides in arguments are welcome. And we've not always done a terrific job that way. And I think that's in my university at CU, we were committed to open society and free thinking. And one of my chief jobs as a university president while I was there was to make sure we lived up to that stuff, because we weren't always. Sometimes we got into a certain kind of speak that and institutions get into that easily, and so you gotta shake it up. And that's how we discharge our responsibility to a society to be a place of free debate. But it's a matter of constant vigilance, and the public has every right to be asking us, are you as free as you say you are? And if we aren't, then they should give us a hard time. We're not ivory towers here. We're accountable to the public we serve, and if we don't live up to our own ideals, then we invite criticism, and some of it's been perfectly legitimate in my view.
Speaking of both your universities, or maybe the university more broadly, we had argued previously that universities stand for freedom of speech, tolerance of dissent. What would you say the status of that value is today in universities? Freedom of speech, tolerance of dissent. President Daniels, maybe you want to remark on that?
Sure. Look, we know from the highly celebrated moments, and celebrated may be the wrong word, the notorious moments when we see deplatforming of speakers, when we see heckling that inhibits the capacity to have proper and controversial debates on campus. We know that these moments where, to pick up on what Michael said a moment ago, we're not without blemish, that the capacity to keep the commitment to academic freedom, to open debate alive, protected, fully realized, is hard within society, and it's hard within universities at times, particularly when you have a sense of this real polarization that we now see, not just within America, but indeed internationally. And there's a sense that for a lot of people, this is trench warfare. We've got to protect our moral certitudes. We've got to really dig in. And I think those are the moments when the ability to have open and vigorous debates on campus is sometimes in peril. And as I said a moment ago, they get lots of attention. Having said that, I would say a few things. One, I think those moments, though they command a lot of attention, and they are moments that are important in terms of signaling risk to the institution and motivating institutions to repair the excesses in those moments. The fact is, those moments are relatively infrequent on the life of campuses. For the most part, we're constantly bringing controversial speakers onto campus, having controversial discussions, inflaming passions, and these events take place without incident. So that's the first thing. I think these moments are infrequent. When they do happen, they're important and they command attention. But I think for the most part, the ideal is well respected and understood within our campuses. Second, just related to that, what I think is important when those moments do happen and there was an incident a few weeks ago at Stanford Law School, which most recently has commanded a lot of attention when the Federalist Society there brought a judge in to speak and was essentially challenged in being able to deliver his remarks, and there became significant protests and so forth that took place within the institution in a way that violated commitment to open debate. What is significant is that the dean, Jenny Martinez, wrote a really courageous and compelling statement to her law school and indeed to the university community, and something that was distributed widely, in which she underscored the foundational commitment to academic freedom and free speech, and the extent to which the kind of heckling, the inhibition of that event that took place was outside of permissible behavior within the institution, and has taken actions not simply to declare those values, but to embark on a program to clarify the values of the Stanford Law School, to ensure proper fidelity to them with education of the community, work on thinking about ways in which you can strengthen culture at Stanford Law School, to again properly recognize the importance of the university as a place apart where difficult, challenging conversations take place and where orthodoxy of any variety is subject to challenge. So I think that's an important dimension this as well. So many of the cases that get noted and focused upon within the media ultimately also trigger important institutional reactions where values are clarified, affirmed, and institutions grow and become stronger as a consequence of that. And again, on the Stanford Law case, I think there's very clear evidence that that's exactly what's happened, as in other cases that have occurred over the last many years that I've been university president. The final thing I would say is that I think that we can do more to foster the habits of debate and openness to difficult conversations as university leaders. One of the things that we write about in the book that you held up earlier, David, is that there's far too many events on campus which are sole speaker events, in which one group on campus is bringing in people who will essentially speak to the viewpoint, the orientation that they have, and so that this becomes almost self-reinforcing to a very small group of listeners, rather than thinking about having more events which are in the nature of debate, conversation, where we very deliberately structure moments where conflicting views are presented, claims are challenged, facts are contested, values are asserted, in the way that, civic conversations often at their best take place. It's not always meant to be a love-in among people who all share the same view. The best conversations are when you can start to find out what it is that separates us, explore that, to see whether we're fighting over different values or we're fighting over different claims as to empirical states of the world, where again, maybe through conversation, we can actually get to a better place and narrow the gaps between us. There's far too few of those kinds of moments on university campuses. And I think it's not surprising that if we don't have more of those events, that the students and even I would say the faculty, we lose kind of the muscle memory to have those moments where we're really working across the various divides in our society. And again, I think this is that normalizing more of that conversation, structuring more of that conversation, I think would be a helpful way in which, again, we can reinforce what is absolutely central to our identity and to our value proposition as universities in a liberal democracy.
Thank you, Professor Ignatieff. Any thoughts on freedom of speech, tolerance of dissent?
This is a tough one, and I think especially in the United States at the moment, a society that is, I think, deeply polarized. It's inevitable that universities will feel enormous pressure from outside in a way that I think is unique in my lifetime. I don't know about Ron. The university is subject to more external political pressure on this issue than any time I can remember. And I was in university in the Vietnam era in the 60s, but now the attacks on the university's very right to kind of hold a kind of space for free and open debate is I think quite unprecedented. I think we shouldn't be surprised. I think we shouldn't set our hair on fire. We're universities, we're institutions at the center of vital debates. The old cliche about knowledge being power is certainly true. And because knowledge is power, these debates are extremely important. The one thing that I think we're having a lot of difficulty with young students with is to separate opinion and identity. Sometimes the reactions that students have had to when I've invited a controversial speaker to CU, they felt their identities attacked. And I found that puzzling because this man had opinions, but it didn't seem to me by any stretch of the imagination that he was attacking their identity, their dignity, or their self-respect. He just had opinions that they didn't like. So getting us to think through in the university community, the difference between an identity and an opinion, between a conviction and who you are at the core, and the sense that everybody is vulnerable in their identities are vulnerable in ways I find surprising. Now, people then quickly jump in and say, well, you're a white male. What do you know about how vulnerable identities can be? I get that. But even so, I think we have to talk to students not merely about controversy, not merely about difference of opinion, but about the relationship between, as I say, opinion and identity, and hopefully come out with a more robust sense of identity. I mean, just a sense of, say what you will. I am what I am. You are what you are, and on we go. Do you know what I mean? This is one of the things that's been a bit of a wake-up call for me to see how deeply threatened some students are, and also some faculty are, to opinions which challenge identity. And I think that's an area where we got a lot of work to do, and a lot of understanding, a lot of listening to do.
I wanted to go to one of the questions that we've received. And again, for everyone on this call, please, if you have questions, please write these in the Q&A. One of our audience member asks, should we make any distinctions between private universities like Johns Hopkins and state-funded institutions whose mandates and constituencies are at least nominally particular? Ohio State falls to mind. Do such institutions have different responsibilities or meet those responsibilities in different ways?
You want me to start, David?
Since you've leapt at it, why don't you go first?
I was asking a question of clarification, and then you've construed that as my leaping out. Okay, well, with that, I will go forward. So, look, I actually think that first and foremost, the distinctions between so-called public and private, and I always emphasize not-for-profit institutions, like a place like Hopkins, the distinctions are really not nearly as large as they once were. When you look at, first and foremost, the kinds of funding that a place like Hopkins receives, you'll see that the largest percentage of funding we receive, in fact, is from the federal government. So we actually, if one looks at budgets, it's true we don't get a lot of money. We get some, but we don't get a lot of money from the state of Maryland. But we get a lot of money for a research enterprise from the federal government, as does Ohio State. Again, so on funding streams, we have a substantial indebtedness to the federal government. We rely on tuition, but it turns out over the last several years, there's been a significant growth and increased dependency on the part of public universities on tuition revenue. And so that too becomes a place where we're seeing conversions. If you look at the role that we play within our local community, there's a whole host of challenges that the city of Baltimore, which we're proudly located in, has, and we lean into those challenges in a number of different ways, in a manner that it kind of looks not terribly different from what our state universities are doing. So on a lot of levels, the distinctions between our institutions over time are actually, I think, narrowing, and we're becoming to look a lot alike. And in that respect, what I do worry about is if we take again seriously this idea that what we do best is to pursue novel ideas, to encourage serious interrogation across a whole domain of different intellectual activities, from engineering to medicine to basic biology to humanities and social sciences. If we share that, then the question is, how do we pursue those activities best? And from my perspective, whether it is a not-for-profit private institution or a public university, the clear and best way to do that is organized through an autonomous institution that has clear responsibilities for self-governance in the public interest, but in a way that makes it resistant to the fads and the fashions of the day and the influences of the executive or legislative branches of government, where someone is offended by this or that issue and therefore wants to shut down this program or limit this person's ability to speak up on these issues. I think that's really, whether we're talking about a public institution or a private one, it's deeply inimical to the core role that we play, and which requires this independence of government. Independence from these kind of political pressures. And in a way, when we do that well, we become more deeply accountable to society for what we are meant to be doing. We still are responsible for educating students and ensuring that they have the right competencies to be successful in the world. We're still, every time we get a grant from the federal government, we have to show that we have done the research that we purported to do and that we have reported it out fairly and accurately. And indeed, we don't get those research grants without going through an extensive vetting process, competitive, meritocratic driven, that ultimately gives us those funds. So there's lots of ways in which, even though we are autonomous, independent, we still demonstrate deep accountability, whether we're public or private. And, in that respect, I think the growing willingness, and Michael referred to this earlier, of politicians to decide that the university is a good sort of playground for the cultural wars is something that is deeply destructive to the institutions and ultimately undermines their capacity to be faithful servants to the public interest.
Professor Ignatieff, thoughts on private versus public higher education?
I think Ron aced the question. I mean, I'm in a small private university in Europe, and so the context is just so different. I feel, in a private university, I have the same obligations to the public that I would if I was state funded. There would be more political pressure on me if I was state funded, but my view is a private university has the same social public obligations as a state university every time. And so what Ron said strikes me as being 100% right. I hope we can find something we disagree about, Ron, but right at the moment we're coming in close together.
Earlier, you were both talking about the role that universities play as an institution of expertise, the production of facts, I think was sort of the terminology we used. A jargony or an academic way of describing this is that the university has a kind of epistemic authority in our society, or at least it's historically had an epistemic authority or role in our society. Do you think the university still has this authority in today's current context?
I think that's a terrific question, and one that is fascinating in the world of social media. You know, we're every single one of us has the equivalent of the Gutenberg Bible in our pockets, and it creates a kind of priesthood of believers. You know, like it's like the Protestant Reformation. Everyone walks around with a sense that they have access to truth and the truth. And I think the conservative fuddy-duddy response to that is say, oh my God, you know, the vandals at the gate, our authority as a institution to creating knowledge is gone. I don't think so at all, but I do think we have to wake up and respond to these challenges. Just to take one little example, which I'm thinking about at the moment, I'm part of a group at Oxford University in England that is thinking about the ethical and philosophical implications of ChatGPT-4, this revolutionary new technology that had just been unleashed upon a waiting world. Well, universities can't stop that. We certainly can't regulate it, but we can help a society think about what it means when a technology of that impact begins to roll through a society, changing how we grade, how we evaluate, changing what we think counts as knowledge. And I think it's extremely urgent for us to be there. We won't be the only voice, but if the handful of companies that control these technologies get to define how the technology is deployed, how it's used, I think democracy as a whole will lose. Because look, what's happening is that a mass experiment is underway. A technology has been unleashed and millions of people are using it. And then because of the feedback loops, their use of it is then changing how the technology performs. And we just don't know where this thing is going. And so in a way, the university's legal, philosophical, technical expertise is more important than ever. I mean, I talk to people at MIT. MIT has some wonderful computer scientists. I'm sure Ron has some fantastic ones at his shop. And this is where you need to put the ethicists, the philosophers, computer scientists in the room and trying to understand what the hell is going on here. It's not the only place where that debate will occur, but it's surely crucial. And I think if universities respond and go out into the world and say, here's a problem, how can we help solve it? It has, I think, the collateral effect of reinforcing our epistemic authority. But the epistemic authority is not, you know, a bunch of people with mortar boards and academic gowns, you know, pronouncing this is true and this is false. No, it's a very different kind of authority. We know stuff, let's get into the debate, let's help, let's assist, you know, be part of the conversation. And in that way, I think universities can reinforce their importance to society. But right now, I think that this technology is a steamrolling through the social fabric. And, you know, universities need to be there.
President Daniels, the university's epistemic authority or its status today.
You know, I'm worried again, as Michael said a moment ago, it's another place where we're in vigorous agreement with one another. And, you know, and maybe this again reflects our shared bias as university presence and as people clearly devoted to the idea of the university. But Michael's cited just the contemporary debates around chat GPT and just like, the huge consequences that emanate from that technology. One, can look across the work of the great universities and see whether the issue is artificial intelligence and its regulation, its impact on foreign affairs, the role of gene editing technology, what it portends for how we think about what the appropriate domain is for human experimentation, medical research, even, thinking about the issues that really frame the context for this debate, David, on the challenges to liberal democracy and how we think about bridging this clearly yawning chasm between progressives and conservatives in the United States and indeed in other parts of the world. I mean, all of these issues are issues that implicate a role for the university, for serious interrogation of these ideas, for the amassing of facts, and for the application of these facts to these contemporary debates. And I again, you see moments in which media can play this role, and at times we see these, we see in the courts and in competitive party politics in the legislature, these debates played out. But ultimately, the things that we do as a university, and in particular, the extent to which we keep going back to the fundamentals, privileging the capacity to challenge dogma and to use facts and principle to do that, really speaks to a distinctive and important role for the university in that domain. I would say the other piece of this, where I think our authority, while not unchallenged and without rival, but where I think we continue to play an important role, is even in the way in which we amass and disseminate data to understand important or challenging social, scientific, political phenomena. And, an example that won't surprise you that, comes close to home for us here at Hopkins is just the experience that we've had through the pandemic, where, what started in the office of one single faculty member in the School of Engineering, not in our School of Public Health, but what started as, a weekend project to be able to track the spread of COVID in Wuhan, China, became the tracker, the COVID tracker that for the better part of the pandemic was the single most authoritative place where people could go to understand the true state of affairs when governments had not developed the capacity to do that. Some cases, they were very deliberately suppressing that information. There was a place to go to, and it's not surprising that place was a university. That it was Johns Hopkins was just dint of good fortune that one of our colleagues did this. And again, I should say, this is the best part about being a university president. There's times that you're really excited about things that people want to do. They come to you, they ask for support. You're able to weigh in and help them. But for the most part, the great thing about the university, and again, reflects our faith and confidence in the work of our students and faculty, is typically people are just going off and doing things that they think will matter, that you have no idea about, and never approved, never supported in any material way other than to give people the ability to be part of the institution. And they do things like happened at Hopkins that will surprise you and can have this huge consequential moment. So I think that capacity that we, through the COVID tracker, were able to contribute to the tracking of the pandemic, I think, underscores another significant role that universities can play in other areas where, who better than us to be trusted agents for the collection, the curation, and ultimately interrogation and interpretation of data that bears on the important issues of our time. Again, I think this is a distinct role for us. So I think for all the moments in which we feel that our authority is being challenged, it may be so, but I think we're also earning and re-earning the right to be not the singular authority, but our really important and trusted authority in our contemporary political moment.
Yeah, if I can just add another example, which is meant to reinforce Ron's wonderful example of the Hopkins tracker, which we all used, I certainly did during the COVID, is the example of Oxford University and AstraZeneca collaborating on vaccine development. And that's a story that's well known, and it's to the glory of Oxford and AstraZeneca, big pharma. But the aspect I think that the public doesn't understand is that, the university had been slogging away at vaccine development, particularly for diseases in the developing world. They've been slogging away at this for 25 years. So when the bad stuff suddenly happens and the world is faced with a global pandemic, you've had guys on benches in labs in universities for decades thinking about, could we use this new RNA technology to develop a vaccine? And so the global sequencing of that virus, the development of vaccines happened incredibly quickly, precisely because universities have been at this for 30 years. And that's important because a lot of times politicians and the public get impatient with these massively expensive investment in basic research. But if you haven't done that for 30 years, you're going to be caught short when the bad stuff happens. And so that's, I think, another lesson that complements Ron's story, which is a story of just somebody doing the right thing in an engineering faculty on a weekend that suddenly scales into something that's of critical public importance for the world. And these are good stories about universities, and they often don't get enough attention because we're focused on, the controversy du jour.
Just Michael, the mRNA example again reinforces another point, which is, the folks, and I know at the University of Pennsylvania, where I spent a bit of time before coming to Hopkins, but the folks who were there working on this, for a number of years were pretty lonely, and there was a belief it's not going to work. Like, this is not a promising technology, and yet again they had the courage, the faith, the conviction to work away at this, and again, the face of significant amount of skepticism, and over time the institution supported them, and again, the rest is history in terms of the multiple breakthroughs that were necessary to pull this off. But again, it's a story of the university giving institutional succor to people to do things that challenge the received wisdom, and that's, again, I think, a great way in which we constantly earn and re-earn our purchase in society is supporting that kind of enterprise. And why, again, it's so important that people in my role are humble about knowing what is going to be promising and what isn't, and the sense of which you really want to be able to support a whole array of different kinds of intellectual activity, whether we're talking about the sciences or the humanities or the social sciences, in which people are straying from the easy path. And that's our role, is to create that environment. And that's where, if we can do better in persuading society that is as troubling as it may be at times to have conventional wisdom being challenged in the institution, ultimately, this is what's required for our society to progress in a number of different dimensions.
Absolutely.
I have another question from the audience, or actually this is maybe a combination of two questions. It says, universities contribute to social stratification, and inequality is one force that threatens democratic functioning. How should we, meaning both universities and citizens, think about how those tensions are being exacerbated?
Boy.
So, Michael, you want to start, or you want me to?
No. You wrote the book, Ron. You should, on this one, you definitely wrote the book with all the stuff you've said about legacy admissions and everything else. I think you should start. I really
Well,
do.
so I'll start, but I'm anxious to hear your views, Michael. Look, I think that when one looks at the growing, if not antipathy, at least skepticism that exists in many parts of American society, I think and in particular, we're seeing that even the understanding of the role of the university is now very much like everything else in America today, becoming a left-right issue, whereas Dems have much greater confidence in the alignment of the university with the public interest. Republicans do not. And so we're seeing this as another wedge issue. I think a good part of that story is the extent to which people, particularly on the right, are reacting to the sense that we have become a place of inbreeding and are perpetuating intergenerational advantage for the best and most advantaged members of our society. And the truth is, the facts bear this out. And it's not just in the United States. Indeed, in my home country of Canada, one looks at Europe, and in a setting where university is tuition is much lower than in the United States, and sometimes actually free, you still see the same patterns where the overwhelming highest percentage of students are from the most socioeconomically advantaged backgrounds. And that's something that we got to worry about and work at. I think government has a really important role to play in ensuring that there's proper access to financial aid, grants, and so forth that will have clear targeting for students from socially disadvantaged backgrounds, socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. The Pell program in the United States long did that. The problem is the Pell program has not kept pace with inflation and certainly not with the rate of inflation of university costs and tuition increases. So that's a serious problem. But then, as Michael's indicated, I think we do things that also reinforce these problems when, for instance, we have clear programs in place, as we do in the United States, to put the thumb on the scales for students who are the children or grandchildren of people who have graduated from the institutions to which they're applying. These legacy programs, just can't be understood as anything other than a naked assault on the ideas of equal opportunity and of merit, which are so central to the American idea. And so I think in these, in this way, these are programs that we as institutions can and should change. And again, I think can go away to repairing some of the skepticism about the extent to which we are perpetuating advantage rather than really honoring the ideas of equal opportunity. And I will say, one of the things just finally that has been really significant over the last couple of years, more than couple, 5, 10 years, that I think has changed in the United States is the extent to which we're really now focusing in a way that I've never seen before on socioeconomic disadvantage and tracking the percentage of our students that are from middle income and low income families who are attending? Are we increasing the percentage of students from those families? Are we educating students who are the first generation of their families to go to university? To the extent that we focus on these things and we increase the percentage of students coming from those backgrounds, I think we, in a very powerful way, dislodge the idea that we are perpetuating rather than ameliorating entrenched advantage in our society. So it's really important we do this.
Yeah, I think Ron it's one of the best things in his book is this focus, among other things, on legacy admissions is something that just has to change. From my perspective, from Central European University, we welcome students from 120 different countries. So we approach the issue of educational disadvantage in a kind of in a geographic way. So we're the place where someone from, former Soviet Central Asia or from Nigeria or from Pakistan can get a high quality education. And one of the issues about which I think we're often very confused is access versus excellence. As if the only way to serve access is to reduce excellence. It seems to me, on the contrary, the kind of thing universities should be saying is we want to demand extremely high standards of everybody. We want a university education to be a really brain stretching and human stretching experience. But we want to be radically egalitarian about who has the shot at it, and we're not getting that. We're not getting that quite right. But that's the challenge we have to meet. And as I say, it's a global challenge. It's not just within the United States. What we've discovered is just there's an enormous population in the world. I mean, maybe as many as 1 billion people. A middle class that has emerged from the prosperity of the last 30, 40 years, that is, is producing kids now 19 and 20 who are looking for an education at a globally high standard. And our universities need to open the doors to these fantastic kids who are coming from just all over the world. Because the equity issue is not just within the United States. It's now an issue of global access to quality education, and we're much too small to make much of a dent on it. But one of the greatest things that American higher education has done since the war has been to open its doors to the world and made more friends to the United States than almost any other institution. And what threatens all that is visa systems that just shut the country down. So that's an aspect of access and equity which is not often discussed. It's the international dimension, but I just wanted to bring that in.
President Daniels, you say in the book that you would like to see a democracy requirement for graduation. What does that look like? Is that a single class that students take? Is that the organization of the general education program? Give us a sense of what you mean by this democracy requirement.
So it's meant to be somewhat vague because I think it's capable of being implemented in a number of different ways. I think fundamentally what it's meant to do is to acknowledge the role that the university should play in ensuring that we educate our students for citizenship and liberal democracy. One of the things in the United States that I lament in the book is the extent to which it's clear now that K-12 education in the United States has fallen far short of the ideal in terms of educating citizens for their democratic responsibilities. And as we've seen in the United States, democracy doesn't become, once started, it doesn't necessarily stay on a self-reinforcing trajectory. where it just from generation to generation continues on without challenge, without incident, without vulnerability. It has to be an obligation that is earned and re-earned if we're going to protect our democratic institutions and democratic habits. In the United States, only about 25% of high school students get any kind of exposure to civics. We know that almost half of America's citizens are capable of identifying the three branches of American government. Again, if we don't educate people on what this enterprise is all about and how you properly discharge your responsibility as a citizen in it, then it's no surprise that we're going to become vulnerable to moments which are decidedly illiberal, non-democratic in character. So given that there's a strong case for education for democratic obligation, and to the extent that K-12 falls short, I think there's a role for universities here to fill the breach. But I think how you do that, and that's why I talk about a democracy requirement, I think can vary from institution to institution. There's some really interesting experiments underway in the United States today, where Purdue University under Mitch Daniels as president had a particular approach that it took in terms of allowing students through a number of different vehicles, whether it was a course or a set of YouTube videos that they were to watch or some written materials that they had to master and then take a test on. That's one way of doing it. Stanford University has introduced a exposure to liberal democracy in its first year curriculum. It's a course that is offered in multiple sections, so there's not one uniform view, but there's a multiplicity of views. Again, the character of the university and how one thinks about democratic citizenship. It's not a singular monopoly view. That's a way of doing it. Here at Hopkins, we've introduced lectures, panels into our orientation program. We have a democracy day where we introduce students early on in their undergraduate experience to the issues, debates extant in contemporary liberal democracy, and again let them see the number of ways in which these important issues are being played out across the research activities of our faculty. I'm hoping we're going to build in a standard set of requirements that a number of different faculty will be able to offer courses that students can satisfy that requirement with. So I think there's a array of different ways in which you can do this, but fundamentally, again, it calls for this recognition that if we're in a moment that we're seeing greater fragility in liberal democracy than we have seen certainly in the last several decades, then I think it behooves us as universities to say, how do we lean in this moment? And how can we, in some sense, touch this important need in a way that speaks to our capabilities and to our responsibilities?
Yeah, I think universities are built for this moment. The difficulty about teaching democracy is simply to get a form of teaching about democracy that understands that democracy itself is a debate about what democracy is. And some of the polarization in the United States right now is a passionate debate about what is democratic and what is undemocratic. And it's a debate about those who have a strongly majoritarian view of democracy versus those who have a view that what democracy is power checking power to keep the people free, which is a more liberal Madisonian view of democracy. But so I'm extremely, and that's what I was doing this afternoon as it happens. I teach a course called Democratic Freedom and Its Enemies at my university to students from 30 different countries. And so that's the second message. Democracy is not the same thing in every country. And American democracy is not the only model of democracy on the table. And so having a democracy element in a university education, especially for undergraduates, seems to me vital, provided that it's not a kind of dead, soul-chilling course in civics, but in fact, an introduction to the most passionate debate at the center of what the American Republic's been all about. And that debate about democracy is what you want to introduce them to. And when you do that, students really wake up. It's intensely difficult to do, and you can expect that the politicians will be looking at it very hard. But if you can do it, it fulfills a vital function for the university and a democracy, no question about it. And Ron is entirely right to focus in his book about that as an issue, because we should be doing it.
Well, we began this conversation with the question, what do universities owe democracy? And I thought we might conclude with the question, what do you think democracies owe universities?
What democracies owe universities is, I think they should demand accountability. They should demand that we be responsible to the societies we serve. But what they owe us is the confidence to let us govern ourselves. And the reason they need to do that is that universities have a special competence in respect of a range of disciplines, some scientific, some humanistic. But if we don't have the autonomy to govern ourselves and to decide how we curate knowledge, how we transmit knowledge, how we acquire new knowledge, we can't do our jobs. That just must be a prerogative that we exercise ourselves. It doesn't mean, I'm not saying leave us alone. I'm saying we have obligations to the society, to our paymasters, to our citizens. But in return, they have to respect the fact that we've been curating knowledge, spreading knowledge, and finding new knowledge for 1,000 years. And sometimes we've got it right. And so we need to be left to do that to the best of our ability.
So I would add to Michael's plea for giving us the autonomy, but also holding our feet to the fire, so to speak, for the kind of accountability that he imagines. I would also add just the grubby but really important issue of financial support for investment. These are expensive institutions to operate. Research is really expensive, particularly in the biological and engineering sciences. It's costly. It requires lots of complex equipment. It requires buildings. It requires all kinds of staff support. It requires ultimately, and this has been the genius of the American commitment to science, has been understanding that supporting universities is a great way in which you advance technology, advance science to the benefit of not just American society, but I believe global society, but it requires investment. And so I think there's an important role for government in providing that investment, particularly because when we're talking about the research we do, that is ultimately published and becomes a public good of support. We know from standard economics, it's in Economics 101, public goods are underprovided by the private sector. And so there's a very important role for government in playing that role. It's a well understood and time-honored role. So we require that. I think also when speaking of the resource issue, as much as I think it's important because of the public goods character of a lot of the work we do within the university that require government support for that. I think the other thing that government/democracy owes the university, and really here the university is just proxy for its citizens, but is to help with the access issue. As I said before, universities are expensive places to stand up and to operate. And to the extent that we know, even with zero tuition, that there are significant challenges for the least advantaged students from families who have low income backgrounds, who have no tradition of going to university, don't find their way easily to universities. There's a role for government here in supporting the capacity of those students to participate in higher education and to provide grant aid and other forms of assistance. Ideally, not just for tuition, but even for the costs of housing, room and board, and so forth that students will face in participating in higher education. And again, I've argued this should not be an entitlement that goes to those families and students from those families who have the means to pay for higher education. But on a means-tested basis, we've got to change the character of the composition of our institutions to much more reflect the richness of our societies. And that means doubling down on providing financial assistance to those students who would not participate in higher education but for it. So I think that these are obligations that I'd like to think are, although funneled through the university, ultimately they're obligations I believe governments and democracies owe to their citizenry at large. We happen to be an important vehicle in making that happen, but fundamentally, the ability to produce great and meaningful research and the ability to give the students who have the capabilities the advantages of higher education, which are financial, of course, but also just go to full participation in democratic life. I think there's an important role for government here.
Well, we knew this was going to be a thoughtful conversation, and it certainly didn't disappoint. I want to thank all of you who attended today, and especially for your thoughtful questions, and especially want to thank Ronald Daniels, Michael Ignatieff. Thank you both very much for joining us today.
Thanks, David. It's great to have had this opportunity. And again, I like the balance of the panel here, that you look for two thoughtful interlocutors, and it all came from Canada. That's a good moment.
Thanks a lot. See ya.
Thank you again.